Today is from Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown in hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Let's pray. Father, as we celebrate your birth, we are reminded that you did not just come as a babe in a manger. You didn't come even to be our sacrifice, although you did come for that, thankfully, but also to teach us your ways, the ways of heaven, the ways of God. You have come to tell us what it means to be righteous, to be right in God's eyes. You have come to make that way available to us. Father, we pray that you would guide us in our understanding. Help me to forget anything that would not be helpful to bring about, that would not be uplifting to you, that would be a distraction or would be wrong. But instead, Father, we pray that through this time we are able to see your ways more clearly, and we are seeing the value of your kingdom and its beauty and its righteousness more fully. Draw our hearts to that, please, God. Be uplifted in this way so that we have a greater desire to serve you. Thank you, Father. Amen. I want to begin by talking about deadly mistakes. And when I began thinking through this idea that we are making very often a deadly mistake in our Christian life in relationship to God and to his ways. Historically, my mind goes back to this, the Maginot Line. And some of you are a little familiar with this. This is a line that France built, a line of fortifications, in the years between 1929 and 1939. Now, if you know your history, World War I, static, bloody, deadly war. France lost millions of its men in a senseless ground war against Germany, and of course other nations were involved as well. But after that, and when it became apparent that there might be another threat from Germany to the east, in 1929 they began this building of fortifications. This was an incredibly complex and technically amazing engineering feat. This is one of the hundreds of fortifications that would be able to cover each other on this Maginot Line. It was built into the side of the mountain like they all were. They all looked a little bit differently, but you could see all the complex mechanisms there. And here's another picture of people going into one side of that. Here's a picture of some of the different layers of activities. Even today, they have kept one of these preserved. You can see they even had underground rail tunnels between the fortresses. And again, there are hundreds of these large fortresses like this, and then hundreds and thousands more of smaller ones as well. Now, can you imagine how much work and effort and resources went into building this? These were made out of concrete for the most part, but the incredible amount of manpower and skill and resources, why just the steel alone, and again, these aren't primarily steel structures, but just the steel alone would have been enough steel to make 5,000 tanks. So this is the Maginot Line. Now what happened? This did. This did. The Maginot Line proved incredibly ineffective. France was out of the war after the conflict started in earnest within a matter of a month, basically. So it was decided very quickly, and France, for the rest of that war, for the most part, sat on the sidelines. All it could offer was a little bit of resistance here or there. And in this, they suffered for years under a most brutal, brutal occupation. Now, where am I going with this? Here's where I'm going. There are times when, with good intentions, we can make deadly mistakes because we're not understanding what's going on here. This would have been a great fortress for World War I. But the problem was that the French Army Command was fighting the last war instead of the war that would happen. A war which was highly mobile, which was not going to rely on ground armies punching it out over a few yards of land like in World War I, but highly mobile, fast armies of tanks and planes, of which France did not have enough of good quality or good quantity because they had sunk so much into this defensive fortification. You see, you can have good motives, but still make a deadly mistake. I'm bringing that up because I believe when we see the Sermon on the Mount, we see something very, very deep about our own spiritual walk with God. And I put it this way, that kingdom righteousness is not a matter of external conformity to a law over us. That is a deadly mistake. But rather, it is a changed heart within us that loves others and seeks their good. Kingdom righteousness is not a matter of external conformity to a law over us, but a changed heart within us that loves others and seeks their good. And I want to develop this just a little bit more, this idea, before we actually get into the text, because it is so crucial that we understand this idea. Jesus put it this way: make a tree good, and its fruit will be good. Or make a tree bad, and its fruit will be bad, for a tree is recognized by its fruit. This is one of the main ways that you see that Jesus is talking about a fundamentally different way of relating to God in his righteousness than the Pharisees had. And sometimes we're not quite there yet. We're still relating to God, even though we're saved by grace, in a way like the Pharisees had, that it's this law over us that I have to conform to in order to be righteous. But Jesus is talking about an inward transformation through which we become the kind of people that naturally do the essence of the law. And that's a very different thing. You see, the primary paradigm of thinking for the Pharisees was legal. That's why we often call them legalists. The question is, what's allowed? When are you breaking the law or the command? But for Jesus, as we see here, the primary paradigm is biological or agricultural. The idea that there is this organic process of involvement and growth inwardly. And so he speaks again, you will recognize a good tree by its good fruit. If you have a good tree, you will have good fruit. If you don't have a bad tree, you'll have really crappy fruit, if any at all. And the point he's trying to make here is that too often what we're trying to do is have a bad tree and yet tape on or staple on or strap on some sort of healthy fruit. And it's just not going to work. One last quote here before we look into the passage itself. This is in your bulletin, or not in your bulletin, in your sermon notes. Dallas Willard is probably the man I would recognize in my life as having the deepest insight into what the heart of Jesus is within this world in terms of righteousness. And he writes this: Jesus knew that we cannot keep the law by trying to keep the law. To succeed in keeping the law, one must aim at something other and something more. One must aim to become the kind of person from whom the deeds of the law naturally flow. The apple tree naturally and easily produces apples because of its inner nature. This is the most crucial thing to remember if we were to understand Jesus' picture of the kingdom heart given in the Sermon on the Mount. With that in mind, let's get into this. First things first. Jesus gives 3 areas. Now, overall, he gives 6, right? And last time we looked at the area of anger and using our anger to hurt other people, either through our words, insults, fool, raka, or violence, ultimately, the ultimate expression of that being murder. And Jesus reminds them that simply not doing the last thing on the list, the worst thing on the list, is not being righteous in this area. But rather, being righteous in this area is actually desire to help the other person instead of to hurt them, no matter what they've done or what their claims are upon you. That is an inward transformation that you cannot legislate, right? And so here, he begins talking about the area of sexual temptation. He says, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. Now, is that in the Old Testament? Sure. Again, it's right there in the top 10, right? 10 commandments. There are 613 commands in the New Testament. The Jews recognized that you would have the 10 commandments as kind of the heart or the most important of those. And Jesus goes on a bit to say, okay, but I want you to recognize that you can violate the heart of this command. You can commit adultery in a way that does not involve physical activity at all, simply looking at a woman in order to lust. And that's the focus of the words, by the way. It's the way it's phrased in Greek. It's not looking at a woman and feeling lust, but looking at a woman for the purpose of lusting. So there's a bit of a distinction that probably we need to keep in mind. Now, what's this mean? Is Jesus saying that that kind of lustful look is equal to adultery, that it's the same thing? And the answer, of course, is no. Actual physical adultery is far worse because it's going down that same road to the very end and not stopping anywhere along the way because you want your desires to be fulfilled, knowing that it will hurt everyone involved in the situation, but especially any spouses or children that are going to be affected. Actual adultery is way worse. That's not his point. He's not equating that any more than he's equating anger with actual murder and saying these are morally equal. His point is this: we're not righteous if we simply do not commit the act of adultery. We're not righteous in this area because God's desire is not that you simply don't do something, but that you express the love of God towards the other people in your life, including those that otherwise you would have that temptation to look lustfully after them. I put it like this: to let love replace lust. Jesus goes on and talks about if your right eye offends you or causes you to sin, cast it off. Now, we have to remember, Jesus does love to use hyperbole. This is not a command to actually mutilate your body. And he never commands us to cut off our right hand, literally. His point is that this is a serious enough matter that if there's something that causes you to sin, you should exclude it from you, even if otherwise it would be very handy. A right hand is very handy, right? But he says you should get rid of anything that would cause you to sin because this righteousness is so valuable and beautiful. And you can apply that in different ways. There's no one way that applies to everybody. I was, talking to someone and they're saying that they love the TV show Game of Thrones. And, I wanted to watch that. I heard it was very well written. I heard, there was a lot of good drama and everything. And I turned it on one Sunday evening, and the moment I turned it on, it was some weird sex scene. And I won't go into the details there. But I'm like, okay, maybe some people can watch this and it doesn't affect them, but I'm not one of those people yet. Maybe I need to be a little older here or something. But you know what? I wanted to watch that. I wanted to watch that because it had a lot of good qualities. But I had to say, no, I'm not going to, because I feel like it would affect me in a way that would cause me to sin. That, I believe, is what the heart of what he's talking about, because you want to take this very seriously. Now, some people have done this. Let me give you a way that this can be fulfilled without love. One of the early movements in the church was the movement of hermits and especially people who would be called aesthetics, many of whom moved away from human society because of all its temptations, but especially sexual lust. And so they actually moved where they would see no one, including no women. Or sometimes they would form monasteries where they would go years, sometimes the majority of their life, without seeing any women. I mean, if you can't see them, you can't lust after them, right? That was kind of the idea. Think about that, though. That means they were not involved in community with not only a spouse, but their sisters, their mothers, the other people who could benefit from interaction with them and that they could receive that. Does that sound like the kind of love that Jesus is talking about? You see, if the only goal is not to have a lustful thought to a certain woman, then that's a good answer. But that is certainly not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about a righteousness that is so changed within us that we desire not to look that way at a person because we love them and we love the people in their life, including their spouse or future spouse. That's a kind of kingdom morality, one that comes from within us. And I like what Dallas Willard said here about this whole thing. He says, for the person who is transformed into kingdom righteousness, the hard thing would be to choose to lust. That's what would go against their nature. The hard thing would be to choose anger and violence or cutting someone down with your words. That would be the hard thing for you because that's what would be going against your nature. What Jesus is talking about is not imposing a deeper, more burdensome law, but showing us an inward transformation in which righteousness grows out naturally like apples from a good and healthy apple tree. He goes on here. There's a second area, the area of divorce. Now, the Pharisees had their way of dealing with this. And again, their paradigm and their thinking is in the realm of legality. And so the question is, what divorce is legal? And more particularly, the question is, okay, you've got a wife that you don't want anymore. What are your legal options? What can you do and still be within the law, but also within the law of God, the commands of God? And their answer was twofold. Well, first, you have to give a certificate of divorce. And the Old Testament law said, if you divorce a woman, you must give her a certificate of divorce. Now, what was that about? Well, basically what you were doing is you were giving a legal document that saying this woman was no longer married to you, instead of just sending her away. Maybe you draw her back when you changed your mind or whatever, but you're just sending her away. Still a married woman, but you weren't living with her. And one stipulation here of the law was, no, you can't do it that way. You have to give her a certificate. And then the second thing is that you have to have a legal cause for divorce. What was that legal cause? Well, that was a good question. There's a parallel passage a little bit in Matthew 19, and some Pharisees came to him and said, is it lawful, again, see that paradigm? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, there are actually two schools of thought among the Pharisees. Again, the paradigm was legal. On that, they were agreed. But on what made it legal, they disagreed. There were some, the more conservative approach, that said it was, according to the Old Testament, some unseemliness is the way it's translated. Usually that's understood as some sexual sin on the woman's part, like adultery. But there are other rabbis who said, no, unseemly is much broader than that, and it can mean pretty much anything that the husband determines to be unseemly. And there is one rabbi about the same time period, and he said basically if a woman burns a meal and the husband finds it unseemly, or, and yes, he actually said this was not a majority opinion as far as I can tell, but it was one of the options. He said, this rabbi, if a husband finds another woman whose looks please him better, he finds his first wife unseemly in that way and is legally justified in divorcing her to marry the other person. Now that's what happens when you have this legal paradigm, right? You have to figure out all the terms and all the loopholes and all the ways. Let's just step back here for a second. Well, let's just step back here a second. What's going on? I think one of our main problems with this understanding this whole area is that we interpret these words in our society's understanding and practice of divorce. Jesus was talking to people, Jewish people, living in first century Palestine, who had a very fundamentally different understanding of what divorce looked like. Here's the main thing. Only the man could initiate divorce, not a woman. A woman could be divorced, but she could not divorce. That was the main distinction. And so because of that, it's very obvious where this is going to go. It's going to be something that men use to get rid of a wife that they no longer want, while the woman is left completely powerless and is going to be a victim in this situation. Because if she is divorced by her husband, and again, she does not have a say in this, and this wasn't just in Israel, this was all over the ancient world, what's going to happen to her? Well, all of a sudden now, she finds herself as a single woman, and somehow she has to live. But unlike her brothers, she has never learned a marketable trade. She's not going to be a carpenter. She's not going to be a fisherman. Even if she had those skills and they'd been taught to her like they were her brothers, it's not like there's just this equal opportunity office that's going to make sure that other people are going to employ her. Her life is dramatically changed for the worse. Best case scenario, she's got a relative who will put her up. But even then, how many men are going to put up this extra female relative of theirs for decades without resentment and treating her like crap, basically, right? Or she might find another husband who would marry her, but again, in that culture, she's divorced, she's damaged goods, and he's probably not going to let her forget it. Or, last resort, she could resort to prostitution. And all these options only became available to her, by the way, if she had the certificate of divorce. That's why that was so important to her. Or she would become a beggar. Not great options. This is how we have to understand what Jesus is talking about. And so he says, I want you, when you practice this in the area of divorce, I don't have that last part right, do I? It's not. I want you to look for the good, to honor marriage, and the good of everyone involved. So Jesus first of all says, look, God's desire is for that marriage to stay for their whole life. That is his desire. Do everything you can to seek that. Do everything you can. From the beginning, God says, this is male and female. Put them together for their life. Because there's deep theological significance, but it's also the best thing for that couple. Usually. But there are times where that's not the case. Sometimes it's that vow is broken because of adultery or because of other things that have made that marriage entirely unlike what it was designed to be. And this is an area where, frankly, I've had a change in my feelings and my viewpoints over the years. I've been a pastor for 30 years now in some form. And when I first began, divorce is always wrong unless there's adultery, because that was my mindset was legal. And then life happens. And when you're a pastor for 30 years, you see that there are some marriages that are so broken and dysfunctional within this broken and dysfunctional world that you can't say, no, you have to stay married to their person simply because they haven't committed the act of adultery yet. That's an area where I've shifted. Some of you might not like that, but I got to be honest, that's where I am. Because what I see in Jesus is not an emphasis on what is law, what is legal, what are the rules, but rather honor this gift of marriage. But recognizing this broken world, you've also got to care for the people like the woman in their culture who will be so harmed by the option. Sometimes, though it's never the best option, it's never God's desire, there are cases where it becomes the least bad option. At least that's where I have landed my understanding over the past 30 years. All right, one other area here. Kingdom righteousness in the area of vows and oaths. This seems weird to us, right? Jesus talks about swearing on different things like the hair of your head and the city of Jerusalem. What in the world is that about? Well, there's a parallel passage where Jesus Matthew 23, he goes on these 7 woes where he's just laying into the Pharisees, okay? So the whole passage starts with him talking about the Pharisees. And as part of that, I think that's the second part of the 7 woes he gives them. Woe to you blind guys. You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools. Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men. Which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and the one who sits within it. All right, so this kind of gives us a little bit of an illustration of what's going on here when Jesus talks about these oaths. There was going on this idea that you could make an oath or a promise to verify your truthfulness, to get someone else to believe you, and you would solidify that, you would guarantee it by making an oath. Say, for example, on the gold of the temple. I swear by the gold of the temple that I will do this. Or I swear by the throne of God that this is true. It was a way that had developed. Again, the Old Testament was about you were able to make oaths to God, vows to God. But if you do, make sure you keep them. And this was abused within a human system of trying to get through all the loopholes, of becoming a way to manipulate other people to believe you by swearing on some sort of spiritual reality. Jesus recognized here. The people were doing this basically not to honor God and to please him as a response to what he's doing, but as a way to manipulate each other for their own personal gain. Now, we don't do it quite like this today. I mean, kids do sometimes, right? You know, if I cross my fingers, what I just told you, all of a sudden becomes null and void. So I cross my fingers, and that undoes everything I've just said, right? Now, we don't do that today, quite those terms. But there are ways that we manage our brand through what we say. We're not completely honest with each other. Sometimes we're actually duplicitous in our understanding. And as long as we're technically or legally correct, we think we're okay. And Jesus tells us, no, the kingdom morality is, I love you. I love you. I want to seek your good. Therefore, I'm not going to lie to you or mislead you or deceive you, even if my words are technically correct in some way. I'm just going to tell you the truth. And you can respond to that as you are able to, as you choose to. But as an act of love, I'm not going to harm you through my words or my violence. That's what we talked about last week. I'm not going to commit adultery with you or someone else. I'm not going to abuse marriage and the permission of divorce. And I'm not going to deceive you. I'm just going to be who I am. This is a morality you cannot legislate. And it's for this reason Jesus comes back again and again to these ideas. That's not about the paradigm of law, but it's rather this idea of just becoming, growing into this person organically that does these things. I come back to this phrase, or this quote by Dallas Willard. Jesus knew we cannot keep the law by keeping the law. I love that. Jesus knew we cannot keep the law by keeping the law. I'm going to end with one more illustration, also taken from World War II, as it were. Some of you remember Eternity magazine? It was like Christianity Today in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It was a great evangelical magazine. Unfortunately, it's no longer being printed like so many magazines. Joe Bailey was an editor. He was the editor of Eternity magazine. And in the years following World War II, he had went to interview some of the German soldiers who had been devoted German soldiers in the German army during World War II. Two of them had been put up for promotion to become second lieutenants in the Nazi army. The commandant told them that he would approve their promotion on one condition, that they join the officers' club. Being a member of the club was good for their career, but it would require them to attend some weekend dances. These young men believed that dancing was wrong, and because of it, because it could lead to immorality, as they had been taught. So because of their convictions, they turned down that promotion. Later, these same men were assigned in their military careers to the death camps, where thousands and hundreds of thousands of Jews were stuffed into ovens and killed. And even though these two men did not directly participate in the slaughter, they knew what was going on, and they never voiced any protest. And when Joe Bailey talked to them 10, 15 years after the war, they looked back on their experiences with no regret, convinced they had made the right decisions in both cases. That is a perverted, unloving righteousness. That is what Jesus is warning us against. And here's what he's showing us the way towards. This is the good news of the gospel. Jesus did not come to give us a more intense law, to give us a greater burden of keeping that law. He came to transform us into the beings who very naturally desire and express that kind of righteousness, not against their will, not out of fear, not out of obligation of some law and some penalty over them, but as a genuine desire of our heart. The penalty has been paid for. Romans 8:1, there is no condemnation for you right now. You go out and you break every law, there will be some natural consequences. But even then, the cross has paid the penalty. You are free from that. But that doesn't mean you just go out and do whatever you want, because if you really have got this, if Christ is really within your soul, if the Spirit is really living within you, that is for freedom to live the kind of life that you were created for in the first place. To be an apprentice of Jesus Christ, doing the things he would be doing if he were walking in your shoes, living his morality, his life, his choices, his value, his love within your situation. That is a beautiful thing. That's what I wish I could get across to myself and every one of us, the beauty and the wonder of that. You have been free from the law so that you can live out the law inwardly with beauty and joy.